It's really a huge honor for me to have the opportunity to speak to you today. Let's talk about building a lasting world. And I think really the main thing I would like to share with you is that I think what we need to achieve sustainability, as we've talked about it, is we need a shared vision of sustainability. We need a shared vision of what it means to have a sustainable built environment. In thinking about what we're contending with, I thought, let me simply state what I think are the big problems that we have. What are the barriers that are keeping us from getting where we need to go, and offer some solutions that I've seen. So let's start with problems. The first one, energy consumption. This is the amount of fossil fuel we're going to burn this year. And I guess I would ask you, what renewable energy supply are we going to develop in the 5 years that we have to replace this? And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that it's more of a question about consumption than replacement with renewable energy sources. I think renewable energy is part of the solution, but really efficiency is, I think, what we really need to focus on. Problem number 2, existing buildings. Problem number 3 is what I would call active buildings. They're buildings that basically have a lot of built-in infrastructure that requires this fossil fuel energy that we have. And then another problem is that we focus on one building at a time. To get the velocity that we need, we should be looking at lots of buildings at a time. And so there's opportunities there. And last but not least, what I would suggest is that we have been focusing on the automobile as this beautiful object that does so many great things for us. We created a model in the US of basically building an entire infrastructure that is based upon the automobile. And what has resulted from that is, of course, sprawl, loss of habitat area, loss of agricultural land. And the results in our society, obesity, diabetes, disconnected families and communities. And so, and not to mention, of course, sitting in traffic for hours at a time. So, so the vision or the ideal of the automobile and the reality is quite different. Well, if those are the problems, what's keeping us kind of stuck where we are, right? What are the barriers? The second clause of Newton's first law of motion is that an object at rest tends to stay at rest. And so I would say that we have an inertia problem. We're really stuck. And yet the third clause says, unless the object is acted upon by an outside force. And so, perhaps this shared vision, I mean, if we can really put together this shared vision of sustainability, maybe that can be the thing that helps us to muster the will to move forward beyond these issues. From my perspective, some ways that we might think about dealing with these issues. The process, for instance, that we use for designing, building, and delivering buildings has a real disconnect. And what I'm proposing is that we actually bring that operations and maintenance team on board and get them involved in design, because that's going to deliver the best building in terms of what that organization needs to operate a building. And in the same way, I would say that often we hear about buildings that are failing after they're handed over. Right? They're not operating. It takes a long time to get them to perform the way they're supposed to. And so I'm proposing that we bring the design and construction team into that operating period of the building, first year or a couple of years, really engage them, make it a part of their scope of services. And I bet you in this model that we wouldn't have that gap, and we would have real continuity, and we would get much better performing buildings that actually operate the way they were designed to. Question about valuation. We need to be placing a value on green building features and efficiency, and we need to figure out how to actually bring that value into the building price, the value of the building. And there's good work going on in this area. And then one proposal is to change the leasing structure, where it's more about shared costs and shared benefits, and thinking about ways for the landlord and the tenant to benefit from making a building better and better. Leveraging that operating budget in a way that you can borrow from those future savings in order to make more investment. And also, when operating savings are brought about, giving it back to the guys who do capital construction. And then something that we're seeing play out quite a bit in the US is, or starting to, is life cycle cost modeling. In fact, the state of Washington requires all projects to do life cycle cost modeling. The second solution is to empower individuals. In the way that we design and build buildings, we often don't want the occupants to touch the buildings at all, right? It's like the story of the librarian. The happiest librarian is the librarian where nobody comes in to borrow books. And so, in this case, we are talking about buildings that basically are automated. We lock off the controls. We don't have operable windows. And we really need to change that. We need to engage occupants, right? And the way we need to do this is really to inform those occupants. The third solution is shifting mode. That bicycles are part of the solution, actually a really big part of the solution. And then the fourth solution is scaling up. And so I'm going to close with the fifth solution, which is living buildings and living communities. So I'm on the board of the International Living Building Institute, and we've put out a standard called the Living Building Challenge. So this is an international standard. There are 70 projects underway right now, 4 nearing certification in the US. And basically, this is a standard that's very, very aspirational. And the idea is to basically think of a building or a built environment as the metaphor of what a flower does, right? A flower is rooted in place, yet it harvests all the energy and water that it needs. It's adapted to site and climate. It's pollution-free. It's very integrated, and it's beautiful. And what I love about this standard when you read it is, and it puts forth that it's a visionary path to restorative future. And what I love about it is it describes ideal conditions. So if you imagine ideal conditions in the built environment, for instance, I'd like to treat all of my water on site and reuse it in a closed loop cycle. And then it talks about current limitations. So in this case, if you tried in Portland a couple of years ago to do this, you would run into code barriers, right? Legal requirements that would prevent you from doing that. And so what's happened with this standard is it's actually led to code changes. So now in Portland, in Oregon, you can reuse gray water, you can do wastewater treatment on site, and it's now legal. So the standard not only has been visionary, but it's also changed the legal structure allowing this to happen. And so it's very straightforward. There are 7 categories with 20 imperatives. Things included like urban agriculture, net zero water, net zero energy, the materials red list, a list of toxic materials that should not be in buildings and you can't put in your building, including issues like human equity and beauty, a standard that gives you credit for beauty.